Welcome to the second talk in this year's Edinburgh Lectures in Language Evolution. I'm Jenny Culbertson. I'm the director of the Center of Language Evolution here at Edinburgh. You'll see I'm looking out at some of the other members of the center here with me. The rest of you are joining virtually, but thanks very much for being here. This second talk is following on a very successful first talk by Ev Fedorenko. If you missed that talk, please go on YouTube and check it out. It's already been viewed more than 1,000 times, so you'll be in good company. Right, so we're really pleased to continue with the series today. So we've got Tom Griffiths today. You should also come and join us for next Thursday's talk by Tecumseh Fitch, and then on Thursday the 23rd we'll have Asifa Majid, and we'll follow that talk with an in-person reception. So by all means, if you're in Edinburgh and you join us for that, feel free to come along to the reception afterwards. So I want to say, before we start, again, thanks to our student organizers. So that's Henry Conklin, Ashleen Kyo, and Elizabeth Pancratz. I'm going to invite Ashleen up now to introduce Tom.
Okay, is the owl on me? Yes, there we go. Okay, so our speaker today is Tom Griffiths. Tom is Professor of Psychology and Computer Science at Princeton University. He's director of the Computational Cognitive Science Lab, which conducts research on topics including causal induction, probabilistic reasoning, category formation, language acquisition, and cultural evolution. He's cultivated a pioneering approach to understanding the foundations of human inductive inference by analyzing human cognition in terms of optimal or rational solutions to computational problems, developing models based on principles of probability theory. His work on Bayesian iterated learning has been particularly influential on a lot of us at the CLE and forms a core part of the curriculum for our MSc students. So take it away, Tom.
Great, thank you. Okay, all right, well, it's wonderful to be here. As you'll see, there's a lot of Edinburgh in this talk, so it's nice to have the opportunity to make those connections. And my launching off point for this talk is actually going to be something that came up towards the end of Ev's talk. So one of the things that she mentioned was models that have been used in machine learning to try and capture aspects of language. And when we look at those models, there's something about them which is in many ways quite different from what we see in human cognition. So these are models that tend to be trained on massive amounts of data, requiring massive amounts of computation. And when we look at human cognition, we see something which really, I think, is a different kind of profile in the way in which data and computation are used. So this is just an illustration of this, where this is from a blog post that was put out by OpenAI. And it's looking at the amount of computation and sort of equivalently the amount of data which is being used in training some of these machine learning systems as a function of time. And so here on the horizontal axis, you can see years passing. Here on the vertical axis is the amount of compute being used. And then each of these points corresponds to some recent breakthrough in AI machine learning. And the critical thing here is that this vertical axis is on a logarithmic scale. So there's an exponential increase in the amount of computation which is being used in driving these successes. And when we think about that, these sorts of models which are being trained on sort of increasingly large amounts of data with increasing amounts of computation, it looks quite different from what we see in human cognition, where the kinds of computational problems that human beings solve are characterized by the fact that human beings are subject to very specific kinds of constraints. So one constraint is just on the amount of computation that we can use, right? We have a finite amount of computation we can use to solve any problem. It's that finite amount of computation that we carry around inside our heads. And that places a constraint on the computational resources we have, and a requirement that we have to be kind of efficient in the way that we use those resources. Another kind of constraint comes from the fact that we have a finite amount of time in which to use the data that we acquire, right? So, we're limited in the amount of data that we can get, and whatever data we get, we want to use within a sort of finite horizon corresponding to our life, which is placing, again, a limit on what amounts of data we're able to use whenever we're trying to learn how to solve some new problem. And so human minds, in contrast to the capacities of some kinds of machines, need to solve computational problems that are characterized by these very specific sorts of constraints. And in a recent article in TICS, I argued that, in fact, these constraints lead to humans having to have a particular kind of cognition, they kind of lead to what we think of as intelligence. That is, intelligence is being able to efficiently solve new problems by using partial solutions we have before, formulating goals and so on, and being able to learn quickly from limited amounts of data. And so when we think about human intelligence, it's really, we're thinking about the constraints under which human beings are operating. So in order to solve problems that are defined by these constraints, I think there are a couple of things that are important aspects of human cognition when we try and sort of translate these into computational terms. And the two that I'm going to focus on today are, first of all, inductive biases. So that is, in machine learning, we sort of talk about inductive biases as being those factors other than the data that favor one inference over another. They're the things that we sort of bring to a problem that allow us to select a good solution, even when the limited data that we have is not enough to tell us exactly which solution is the right one. And so if you're going to learn from small amounts of data, you need to have good inductive biases. That's sort of a basic result of machine learning. And the second is engaging in a form of distributed computation. So if we think about humans as being limited in the amount of computation, limited in the amount of data that we have, if we want to solve problems that require resources that go beyond those that can be accessed by any individual, we need to develop algorithms that allow us to share our data, share our cognitive resources with others in a way that makes it possible for us to exceed those individual limitations. And it's worth pointing out, this is actually kind of analogous to what's going on in machine learning. That massive increase in compute that is underlying a lot of those machine learning methods is not coming from making faster chips. It's coming from better ways of combining together the output of CPUs and GPUs in order to be able to solve bigger computational problems. And so this kind of capacity for distributed computation is one of the things that human minds use as a way to go beyond the individual constraints that we operate under. And so this distributed computation is something that manifests both sort of parallel and serially, right? So we sort of see parallelized computation when humans work together to solve problems they couldn't otherwise solve individually. We see serial computation when we have successive generations of humans taking data or partial computational results from previous generations, and then adding to them the data that they acquire and sort of making progress towards a deeper understanding of the world or better solutions to the kinds of computational problems that world poses. And so what I'm going to talk about today is this kind of question of, well, what are the algorithms that we're able to use in order to do this effectively, right? How is it that we're able to accumulate knowledge across successive generations, and a sort of puzzling interaction that has with this other aspect of human cognition, the fact that we have to have strong inductive biases to allow us to be individually successful. So this is going to be a story that's going to be in 2 acts. So Act 1 is going to focus on cultural transmission. I'll say a little bit in a moment what I mean about that. But this is mostly historical work. So I think it's going to be quite familiar to people in the room, but it sort of sets the context for what I'll talk about subsequently. There'll be a brief intermission, which will incorporate some advertisements. And then in Act 2, I'll talk about a slightly broader perspective where we bring in some of the elements of cultural evolution more generally. So in this first act, I'm just going to think about these kinds of processes of cultural transmission, and then what the consequences of inductive biases are in this setting. And when I talk about cultural transmission, I'm kind of making a distinction between this and cultural evolution more broadly. It's kind of motivated by thinking about cultural evolution within a formal framework, something like the kind of replicator dynamics, a sort of standard model that we use for thinking about, say, biological evolution, right? So within this kind of model, we imagine that we have successive generations of individuals. Those individuals are particular types. And then those individuals have some, in the sort of generic replicator dynamics, some sort of cultural fitness, which is going to be basically like what the propensity is for those individuals to be selected as parents of the next generation. One way that you can do that is in terms of, if you imagine the next generation making choices about who they're going to learn from in the previous generation. And then when we have our sort of process by which this information is transmitted to the next generation, through that transmission process, it can undergo changes. Those changes here are characterized by this matrix Q that gives us the chance that a parent of type I, say, has a child of type J, right? And so when I'm talking about cultural transmission, what I'm talking about is zooming in and focusing on one aspect of this sort of more general model of cultural evolution, which is just trying to understand this transmission process. So ignoring stuff about cultural fitness completely, and just trying to understand how the transmission process itself changes as a consequence of the inductive biases of learners. And the framework I'm going to do that in is a framework that, again, is going to be quite familiar. It's this framework of iterated learning. So I really started thinking about all of these issues as a consequence of reading some of the papers that Simon Kirby had written about how it is that the process of learners learning from other learners changes the structure of the languages that those learners are transmitting. And I'm going to focus on the simplest possible case of this, where we have a sequence of learners, each of whom is learning from data generated by the previous learner, forming some hypothesis about the process by which those data were generated, generating data themselves based on that hypothesis, and so on. And we're going to start to formalize this. So we're going to sort of put some mathematical structure on this, just by assuming that the way that this is done is that at each step here, we have some probability distribution that we're choosing a hypothesis from, right? So we have some probability distribution by which learners select hypotheses based on data, and a distribution by which learners generate data based on hypotheses, and so on and so on. So this gives us a sort of basic setup. We can now ask, how this process changes the information that's being transmitted, how the hypotheses of the learners change over time. But to engage with this kind of question about how inductive biases, how the sort of dispositions of the learners change the information being transmitted, we need to have a way of defining what those inductive biases are. And the way that I'm going to do that is via Bayesian inference. So this gives us a formal framework for characterizing inductive biases that learners bring to problems. And so the way that we characterize this is in terms of Bayes' theorem, which gives us a specification of how an agent who has a set of beliefs about the world that are encoded in a probability distribution about a set of hypotheses, where those probabilities tell us how likely it is that that hypothesis would be true. That agent is going to then rationally update those beliefs to end up with a new probability distribution that then tells them, how likely it is that each of those hypotheses would be true based on the data that they observed. And so, the way that this works in Bayesian inference, we start out with this distribution. It's called the prior probability distribution. This is how much the learner believes in each hypothesis before they see data. And then we're going to end up calculating this posterior probability, how much they believe in those hypotheses after they see data. And so the way that Bayes' rule tells you to do this, the sort of rational way to update your beliefs, is to take those prior probabilities, multiply a likelihood. That likelihood tells you how probable it is that you'd see those data if that hypothesis were true. And then there's this thing on the bottom, which is a normalizer. Basically what it's doing is it's taking the same quantity, summing over the space of all of the hypotheses. And all that this is doing is making sure that what we end up with on the left-hand side here is a probability distribution. So if you just write it out like this, Bayes' rule is sort of a pretty straightforward piece of probability theory. But in the context of cognitive science, it's actually a really useful tool for thinking about inductive bias. And the reason is that if we look at the right-hand side here, we have these two things that are being combined together, right? One is this prior probability, the other is this likelihood, and only one of these is about the data, right? So the likelihood here is encapsulating the information about how well a particular hypothesis fits with the data that you observe. And there's this other factor, the prior probability, which is playing just as big a role in influencing the conclusion that you end up reaching. And so if we want to characterize inductive biases of learners, a good way to do that is using this sort of Bayesian formulation to characterize the problem that they're solving, and then trying to think about what the consequences are of adopting different prior distributions. So to now go back to the setting of cultural transmission, we can make the assumption that our agents here are little Bayesian learners, and that the way that they're solving this problem is by initially the assumption I'm going to make is that they're calculating a posterior distribution over hypotheses based on the data that they observe, and then they are updating. So they're sort of calculating this distribution. They're performing Bayesian inference to calculate the posterior, and then the way that they're generating the data is by sampling a hypothesis from that distribution, and then sampling data from the likelihood function that corresponds to that hypothesis. And so now we have a process where they sample data from the posterior, sample hypotheses from the posterior, sample data from the likelihood, hypotheses from the posterior, data from the likelihood, and so on. And we can ask, what happens to this process over time? And the way that we can formalize this is in terms of, you can actually think about this mathematically. We've defined a Markov chain. This is a Markov chain. We can focus on the Markov chain defined on hypotheses. What that means is that at each point in time, which hypothesis you choose just depends on the hypothesis that was chosen at the previous generation. And we can ask a question about what's called the stationary distribution of this Markov chain. That is, if you run this Markov chain for a long time, what's the distribution over hypotheses that it converges to? So if you sort of start out, doesn't matter sort of where you start out, if you run it for long enough, it's going to converge to some distribution. We can actually give a mathematical characterization of what that distribution is, the kind of equilibrium that the system settles into. And so what we showed a long time ago is that if you assume you have these agents who are performing this process of Bayesian inference, the equilibrium that we end up with is the prior distribution. So in the context of this sort of Markov chain setting where we just have a sequence of learners, the probability that an individual learner adopts a hypothesis converges to the prior probability of that hypothesis, regardless of the first hypothesis in the chain. So no matter what you start out with, after enough time, the probability a learner has a particular hypothesis is just the prior probability of that hypothesis. And then the proportion of the population who adopt a hypothesis is going to converge to the prior probability of that hypothesis. So now if we imagine this in that population setting, like the replicator dynamics, we're going to say that the same equilibrium result gives us a characterization of what multiple generations of transmission will look like. And it's that the population will converge to an equilibrium where the proportions of the different types that appear in that population reflect the prior distribution. And this was a result that was with Mike Kalish. So the kind of implication of this in terms of inductive biases, right, is that it suggests that things like cultural universals, the things that we sort of see manifesting in cultures, should result from this process of transmission should be things that reflect the minds of the transmitters, and in this very specific way where there's a kind of one-to-one correspondence between whatever the prior distributions are and whatever we sort of see manifesting from this process. And so if you thought about this in the context of language, this suggests this kind of pretty tight coupling between, say, the distribution of properties you see across languages and the inductive biases inside the heads of language learners. So I was excited about this. This was a pretty cool result. Simon was less excited about this because it was quite a different kind of story from the story that he'd been seeing in his analyses of iterated learning, where he was seeing something where iterated learning seemed to take learners that had weak inductive biases and then have strong consequences for the languages that emerge from that process. And that's quite at odds with this sort of story here. And so he invited me out. I gave this talk that's very similar to this. And then we talked about it and sort of worked it through. And what we figured out was that, in fact, there's a very important assumption that goes into this, which is this assumption that the learners were sampling from their posterior distribution. And if you start to make a change where, say, just by exponentiating this, so what we're doing is now taking a distribution that's quite spread out and then sort of increasing the emphasis on the high probability values. If you go all the way to infinity, you get a distribution which is now focused on just those hypotheses that have the highest probability. You can sort of define a continuum that goes from an agent that's sampling to an agent that's maximizing. And you can, again, try and characterize what the equilibria are under these circumstances. And what you can show is that if you make this change from sampling to maximizing, from learners who are just sort of generating samples from a posterior distribution to learners who are sort of just producing those solutions which are the best solutions, and things like neural network algorithms do something which is more like that than sampling, then you can show that under those circumstances, the equilibrium that you converge to is one which magnifies the effect of the prior, right? So where the prior itself is exponentiated in that same way. And so this gives you a way of understanding how it is that you can have a learner that has, say, a relatively weak inductive bias, but that translates into a strong constraint on the kinds of languages that emerge through processes of cultural transmission. And this is work we did with Simon and with Mike Dowman, who was at Edinburgh at the time. So again, in the context of the kinds of questions that come up when we're thinking about things like languages, right? This gives you a very different kind of picture. The sampling case suggests it's kind of one-to-one correspondence, but when we think about this sort of change to the model where we think about learners doing something more deterministic than sampling, we see a case where weak biases can produce strong universals. And that suggests that things like cultural transmission maybe provide a viable alternative to processes like selection or strong innate constraints in explaining why you see languages that have particular kinds of structures. So this is all kind of theoretical work. We also did a bunch of experiments to explore how you could actually use this as a, well, first of all, to validate the predictions that come out of this approach, maybe think about how you could use this as a way of exploring what human inductive biases are like. And I'm going to show you just results of a couple of these experiments. So this is one of the first experiments we ran was an experiment in iterated function learning, where people are given data that now correspond to XY pairs, and they're trying to learn a functional relationship between those variables. So the hypotheses that they're entertaining are functions about how it is that those variables X and Y might be related. And the way we actually do this in the lab, people are basically learning a relationship between the width of one bar, this is X, and the height of another bar, this is Y. And they do this by adjusting the slider. They're trying to get the red bar to the same position where the yellow bar is going to be when the yellow bar shows up. So they sort of don't see the yellow bar initially. They make a guess. The yellow bar shows up. If they're close enough, they go on to the next trial. If they're not that close, they have to adjust. So there's a kind of incentive to get it right. And in these experiments, people saw 50 trials where they would make predictions and receive feedback. And then there were another 50 trials where they would just make predictions and didn't receive any feedback. And so what we could do is then look at what happens through this kind of iterated learning process with different initial data. And so this is, I'm going to show you results that come from using different kinds of initial data that correspond to different functions. And I'm just going to show you one sequence of learners for each of these cases. So this is our first learner would see these data, this sort of linear function. These are the predictions that they produce. They did a pretty good job. We then take those predictions, those become the data we give to the next learner. They produce these predictions. And then we take those, that's the data for the next learner. They're doing a job. Okay, so this linear function gets transmitted effectively. But what's interesting is if you take a negative linear function, it sort of turns into a positive linear function. And in fact, it doesn't matter too much what you give people, you get this kind of positive linear function out. And so what this is showing is, consistent with our kinds of predictions, right? So this positive linear function is easier to learn than these other kinds of functions. It's the thing that people have an inductive bias towards. And you can actually see that a little bit if you look at just the first generation here. You can see when people are making errors, they're kind of going in the same direction as that positive linear function. They're sort of imposing some positive linear structure on these things that don't have structure. But when you iterate that process, it gives you the opportunity for then that to have the biases to have a bigger and bigger effect on the outcome of the process itself. And we did this 32 times, 28 times we get the positive linear function, the other 4 times we get a negative linear function. And this matches kind of what we know in this literature about the ease with which people learn different kinds of functions. And so in my lab, really what we focused on was less using this as a model of something like language evolution, and more a really powerful tool for revealing things about human inductive biases. So if this gives us something like samples from the prior or some way of manifesting the prior distribution, we can actually use this as a tool for understanding, say, the prior distributions people have about the relationship between variables and causal learning, or the kinds of concepts that they're going to encounter in the world. But we also did some experiments that were more directed at trying to understand aspects of the structure of languages. And I'll show you one example. Again, this is work with Jing Zhu and Mike Dowman, who was at Edinburgh and then came to work with me as a postdoc. So what we actually did was do this kind of iterated learning process with systems of color terms, where this is motivated by the World Color Survey, which provided information about the distribution of systems of color terms across 110 non-industrial societies. And so what the World Color Survey did was basically show people these different color chips and then ask them to produce labels for those chips in their language. And we turned that into an iterated learning task where we were sort of teaching people a new language. We would give them some examples of color chips that belong to a term, and then we'd ask them to generalize. Well, if this is one term shown in white here, this is another term shown in black. They went white and black in the labels we gave them. They had sort of arbitrary word labels. These are just the examples that were given to them. Then we could look at how they would generalize those terms to the rest of this array. And so then we would take those predictions that they generated for the rest of the array, and then the next learner would see some examples of now another set of novel terms, but where we sample the labels which go along with those terms from the responses that were given by the previous learner. And so this is kind of what this looked like as an experiment. Here, people had sort of made some previous decisions, or these are the examples that are provided to them of the labels of different terms. And then they're making decisions about, okay, now what label should you apply to this particular color chip? And so what we can do again is look at what kind of biases manifest from this process. And so this is just with looking at, we ran this experiment with systems that had 2 terms, 3 terms, 4 terms, 5 terms, and 6 terms to try and match what's in the World Color Survey, which has mostly 3 to 6. And there's some other information about languages that have 2 terms that we could use. And so we started out with completely random partitions of that space. And then people started to impose structure on it. So this is after just 1 generation. You can see that there is a more systematic labeling that people are producing based on just sort of being given some random examples. And that systematicity increases. And over successive generations, we see certain kinds of patterns. Like, for example, 2 terms, you either get this kind of light-dark division, or you get something where it's a sort of red is divided off from the other colors. And if we look at examples of 2-term languages, you actually see something which is quite consistent with this. Again, what I'm showing for these other languages at the bottom here is the sort of closest matching color system in the World Color Survey. And the kinds of patterns that we see in terms of the partitions that are produced by people in our experiment actually correspond quite well with particular patterns that you see in the World Color Survey itself. And sort of consistent with this, if we now compute a quantitative measure, where what we're doing is comparing a measure of the difference between 2 partitions for if we choose 2 people in the World Color Survey at random, or choose 2 people in our experiment at random, what we see is that we get sort of convergence over time to something where the difference between the languages that, we take 2 people in the World Color Survey at random, or we take 1 person in the World Color Survey and 1 person in our experiment at random, and we compare those differences, that we see this increase in the correspondence between our systems and those that you see in the World Color Survey as the successive generations of transmission take place. And again, this suggests that something about the nature of human inductive biases here for the perception of color and the way that we form categories can help to explain the kinds of distribution of systems of color terms that we see in the World Color Survey. So these results suggest that there's a meaningful influence of our inductive biases on the outcome of processes of cultural transmission. And that sets up an interesting puzzle. Okay, so the puzzle is, if we have these strong inductive biases that we need to have because we get limited amounts of data, and those strong inductive biases potentially influence the outcome of processes of cultural transmission, how is it that we can actually use cultural transmission as an algorithm, as part of an algorithm that allows us to accumulate knowledge across successive generations and kind of overcome those limitations that we have about the amount of data we can access and the amount of compute that we can execute? So these 2 aspects of the sort of human solution to our finite brains and finite lifetimes, inductive biases and distributed computation, seem to be working against one another, where inductive biases are useful for individuals, but they're potentially sort of not that good in the context of putting together a bunch of individuals who are going to try and sort of learn something and build a better model of the world, right? So the biases that help us function as individual processing units are things that work against us being able to work together and function as a sort of collective engaging in some kind of distributed computation. Or to put this more precisely, how is cumulative cultural evolution, where we're accumulating knowledge or becoming more accurate in our picture of the world, or sort of developing better technologies, possible in the presence of these kinds of inductive biases? And so a first clue to an answer to this, sort of kind of the first pass that we took at this, was trying to cast this question in this iterated learning framework, where now we think about our successive generations in a chain, not just observing something that's transmitted by the previous generation, but also getting access to some new data themselves, right? So now you can imagine this is kind of like, scientists. Each scientist has the opportunity to observe some data from the world. They run their own experiments, but then they also get some information provided by the previous generation. And the question we want to ask is, what is it that you need to transmit between these generations to make cumulative cultural evolution possible? Is there a way to overcome those individual inductive biases and still get a process of cumulative cultural evolution? And so with an undergraduate, Aaron Beppu, we sort of ran some preliminary experiments where we looked at this and sort of contrasted two cases. One I'll call observational learning. So this is where the data that you get from the previous generation is just, the information you get from the previous generation is just data. You get to like follow someone around and see what they do, right? And so you can think about this as being, like the standard iterated learning setup, where you just sort of have hypotheses resulting in data, which results in the formation of new hypotheses. But we're augmenting this with the new individual data that they're getting. And what you can show in this case, there's not a perfect analytic result, but you can show approximately that the posterior distribution you get will basically be the average of the posterior distributions you would get based on the new data, right? There's sort of no benefit of cultural transmission in this setting. That despite the fact that you're getting some data generated by previous generations, it doesn't help you out. The kind of conclusions that you reach would be the same kind of conclusions you'd get if you looked at the data and applied your own prior distribution and so on. And the reason for this is exactly the reason why you get convergence to the prior in the iterated learning case. It's that what you get after many generations of transmission is sort of just the prior distribution of the other genes. This is a kind of negative result. It says that just engaging in this kind of process is not going to result in cumulative cultural evolution. It confirms the idea that these inductive biases and distributed we call trans. Here, the idea you engage in a process which is something more like sort of teaching or using language to communicate something. And what you're communicating is your theory of how the world works. And the way that we modeled this was by saying that, what this does is essentially it takes the posterior distribution this person has in their head and transmits that entire posterior distribution to the head of this person. And that becomes the prior distribution that person uses. And under these circumstances, it's kind of trivial to show that what you're going to get is then accumulation over time, because it's kind of like making these individuals into one giant individual that's just updating those beliefs as they get each piece of data. And so if language is a tool that allows you to transmit theories, transmit posterior distributions in this way, then that would be something that would support cumulative cultural evolution. And we did some experiments that sort of provided some support for this, where we took exactly that function learning task that I showed you before, and we allowed people to transmit either data that was sort of, the predictions that were generated by the previous person in the same way as our other iterated learning experiment, or a theory, which was just a linguistic message that they typed in the box about how the experiment worked. And in this case, the true underlying function that people were trying to learn was a quadratic function. So this was something that no individual was able to learn in our previous experiment. And we were interested in whether now, as a consequence of engaging in this transmission process, they were able to figure this out. And basically the results we get, so this first condition is sort of a replication of the basic iterated learning paradigm, right? We sort of start out with our quadratic function. Here I'm showing both the training data in green and then the responses in blue. So the blue ones become the green ones here, right? And then the blue ones become the green ones here, and so on and so on. Just so that you can kind of see this pattern, but basically we get the same convergence to a positive linear function. In the mixed data condition, we take the data that was generated as predictions from the previous generation, but we combine that together with more data, which is drawn from that underlying quadratic function. So you're getting your own new observations of the quadratic function, but you're also getting these, potentially noisy predictions generated by the previous generation. And as you can see, there's basically no improvement in performance across successive generations. And the only cases where we actually saw people figuring out what the true underlying function were these cases where we allowed people to transmit theories, right? Where they typed their theory into the box. And then in these cases, they were actually able to figure out, okay, this is a quadratic function, and actually do a good job in solving this problem. Okay, so this is the end of Act 1. As I said, it's mostly historical, but here's what it suggests, right? First of all, the outcomes of cultural transmission reflect human inductive biases. These biases can present an obstacle to cumulative cultural evolution. And then maybe the way to think about language is it's a tool that we can use for overcoming that obstacle, allowing us to transmit our hypotheses, right? And get posterior distributions out of our heads and make them into the prior distributions of the next generation. And that seemed like a satisfying kind of story. Okay, so now I'm going to transition to the intermission. As I said, it's going to be mostly advertisements. What I'm going to do is provide an advertisement for something that we did in the sort of 5-year period between this and then the next results that I'm going to present you. And basically what we were doing in that period was developing better methods for engaging with these kinds of questions. And so working with Tom Morgan and Jordan Suchow, as well as a bunch of other people in my lab, we developed a software platform called Dallinger, which basically allows you to run complex algorithms, distributed computations, with humans that we recruit on the internet, right? So we recruit
Tom, can you hear us? Because we've actually lost your audio. Okay, I think we've lost Tom, so hopefully he'll be right back.
Hear us. Yeah, if it's showing.
Yeah.
So you can see the YouTube stream. Yeah.
I guess it's a good time for a break, right? We're in an intermission.
It's really ice cream. It's actually quite hard to tell when you're giving the talk to slides.
It's true.
Bring in a
Yeah,
text
maybe.
message on Zoom. Oh, is he gone completely?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry about this, folks. We're just trying to get in touch with Tom. Tom, do we have you back?
Yep, I'm back. That was
Okay.
more of an intermission than I was expecting. Okay.
Okay, great.
All right. So let's see. So it does this by building a graph where what that graph consists of is a set of human decisions, right? So each node in the graph is a human decision. An edge in the graph indicates that information flows from that decision to then the problem that's posed to another participant. And so now you can sort of build these structures where you recruit a participant, that person makes some decisions, they finish the experiment, you recruit the next participant, that person makes decisions that are influenced by the first person's decisions and so on. And so what it allows you to do is run experiments that are essentially, sort of algorithms with people. And one of the kinds of experiments you can run are experiments that use evolutionary algorithms. So, one of the ways that we're used to simulating evolutionary processes is by doing things like, running agent-based models. In an agent-based model, you would have a population of computer simulated agents where what those agents are doing is, solving some problem, learning something, and then transmitting either their genes or some sort of cultural product to another generation of agents. And then that gets transmitted again via some sort of algorithm that you've defined. And so these kinds of simulations are much more sort of complicated than our sort of standard experiments that we use for exploring things like evolutionary processes, and allow us to, by combining these things together, now run these equivalent sort of evolutionary simulations where we're taking the structure of an algorithm, like a sort of genetic algorithm, and then running that algorithm with people instead of with simulated agents. And as a consequence of doing that, we can explore what specific human inductive biases do in the context of these evolutionary settings, or how it is that specific human learning mechanisms influence the outcome of those evolutionary processes. So just in the last couple of years, we've started to now get results from doing this. It was a big upfront investment. But last year we published some papers looking at, for example, an experimental demonstration of the Baldwin effect and some of the subtleties that show up when you start to think about this with people, looking at co-evolution of learning and memory, doing large-scale tests of collective memory. And then with Bill Thompson, who did his PhD in Edinburgh, a big experiment where we showed that, like those results with Aaron Beppu, we can show that human inductive biases constrain cumulative cultural evolution. In this case, where what's transmitted between generations are more like artifacts. So the problem is designing arrowheads, where you kind of get the previous generation's arrowheads and you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I improve upon the designs that have been used in those previous generations? So if this sounds interesting, again, to sort of conclude the advertising section, we currently have a postdoc position related to this. So feel free to send me an email if you want to find out more. Okay, so that's the end of the intermission. Now I'm going to go on to Act 2. Equipped with these tools, we can actually start to ask questions about more complex kinds of processes of cultural evolution. And so when I talked about this kind of model where we think about, what language is doing is taking posterior distributions, turning them into prior distributions for the next generation, one of the things that you might be concerned about is that that's kind of a big, complicated job, right? It sort of assumes that language is sort of a perfect tool for communicating beliefs. And I think anyone who has, taught a technical class probably has the sense that, in fact, that is not the case, right? That, in fact, trying to explain something to somebody else is extremely hard. Trying to get your theory across to another person is a noisy process. And it's something where, again, there's room for inductive biases to enter. And as soon as inductive biases enter, the sort of mathematical analysis that was presented in that model falls apart. And we're kind of back in the case where it's a question how it is that we get things like cumulative cultural evolution to work. And in particular, this kind of complexity, right? This sort of like, trying to transmit really complex concepts that involve many steps, that actually characterizes a lot of the things that we're interested in cultural evolution. So if you look at things like making tools, navigation, making food, they're all things that have a kind of complex algorithmic structure, right? There's some like sequences of steps you have to follow. If you get one of the steps wrong, it doesn't work. You can have disastrous consequences. They're really complex objects that we're trying to transmit. And they're things that could potentially be things that are very counterintuitive in a way that makes them subject to these kinds of influences from inductive biases that would then make it hard for us to not only transmit, but also maybe innovate on these kinds of methods. And so what we really want to do is understand how it is that these kinds of complex cognitive objects, these cognitive algorithms, can be transmitted. And so in a project with Bill Thompson, Bas van Ophuisten, and Ted Summers, we started to look at this in the context of a task that has a lot more sort of algorithmic structure than the other tasks I've been talking about. And so the way that this task works, you see a set of images. Unbeknownst to you, those images have some numbers associated with them. And your job is to put the images in order such that the numbers are increasing from left to right. And the way that you do this is by if you click on two images where like this, the number on the left is greater than the number on the right, they'll switch places. So if you click on them and they're already in order, they won't switch. But if you click on them and they're out of order, then they'll switch so that they're now in order. And so the problem you basically have to solve is figure out how to make comparisons of these things such that after a sequence of comparisons, you end up with the things in order. And if you've ever taken an introductory computer science class, this is a problem of sorting. And the goal is to sort this set of objects in the minimum number of moves possible. So what we were interested in was giving people this problem, which requires these kind of explicitly algorithmic solutions. What happens when we put this in a cultural transmission context? So we actually had people do this using Dallinger to recruit multiple generations of people. The first generation would see 3 practice problems, then they'd see 9 problems where they were actually scored on their performance, and the score decreases the more moves they make. And then at the end of that, they do a demonstration of the algorithm that they figured out and write a linguistic description of that algorithm. And then that information will be transmitted to the next generation, where if you were an individual in the next generation, you would see that there were a bunch of people who'd done this previously. You'd be able to select a subset of those people to learn from. And then you would get their demonstrations and descriptions, and then go on and do your own solutions, and then produce your own demonstrations and descriptions and so on. And in the first version of this task I'm going to talk about, this process of selecting who you're going to learn from was essentially random. So we had 15 people per generation. You'd see solutions from 8 of those people, and then you could choose 3 of those people to learn from. But the only information you had about them was like sort of arbitrary usernames that were assigned to them. And so what we were interested in was, what are the kinds of solutions that people develop? And what happens to those solutions as they get transmitted across generations? So in the paper, we go into a lot of details about how we figure out what kind of algorithms people are following. It turns out to be kind of hard, but the outcome of that process is identification of a bunch of algorithms that people might be using. It's worth saying, so there's for sorting 6 objects, there's an optimal program for sorting those objects, which if you follow that procedure, you get a perfect score on our task. Nobody does that. So that's kind of just used to define what success would mean here. But there's a variety of different kinds of algorithms people come up with, and those algorithms differ in their levels of success. So I'm going to focus on 2 of these algorithms, gnome sort and selection sort, and tell you a little bit about them, because they're the ones that really are most important in understanding our results. So the first of these, selection sort, is a pretty intuitive procedure. Here's a description that's generated by one of our participants. They say, I started with the first picture, then clicked on picture 2, then back to 1, then picture 3, then back to 1 to picture 4, and so on. After I was done with the first picture, I started with the second, and went second picture to 3, second to 4, and so on. I did this till I was at the end. And so if you kind of follow this through, what they're doing is essentially exhaustively executing all of the pairwise comparisons, right? And so this is just a procedure you follow. You go through, you do all of the clicks of the first picture against all of the others. You then do all of the clicks of the second picture against all of the others, all of the clicks of the third picture against all the others, all the clicks of the fourth and fifth, and so on. And so if you do that, it works okay. You get a score that's around between 0.5 and 0.6, around 0.55. But it's not the best algorithm that people came up with. So the best algorithm people came up with is something called gnome sort. And here's a description. Begin with comparing the second picture to the picture on the left. Once it stops moving, move on to the third picture, compare it with the picture to the left until it stops moving. Then move to the fourth picture and compare it with the pictures to the left. Then move on to the fifth picture and compare it with the pictures to the left. Finally, choose the sixth picture and compare it with the pictures to the left. Once the sixth picture stops moving, the picture should be in numerical order. And basically what this corresponds to is, so here they're making this first comparison. Nothing changes here. So then they move on to now comparing the next pair. Nothing changes. They can do the next pair. And now what happens is these switch. And because one of them switched, they now go back and do the comparisons to the things that they'd previously compared to until they reach a stable solution. And then they go back to here, and then they can do this back again. And so the important thing about this is you don't execute all of the comparisons. Which comparisons you execute are dependent on the outcome of the previous comparisons that you've done. And this might sound a little confusing. That's because it is, right? This is a more counterintuitive algorithm than the selection sort algorithm, but it's one that's more efficient. So if you do this, you get a score of about 0.8 or so on the task. It's actually a pretty good solution to this problem. And so what we can now do is look within our experiment at the kinds of algorithms people use and the kinds of algorithms that get transmitted. And so we can look across generations. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you results where we're kind of going to pull out a lineage of the algorithms that get transmitted. And that lineage is going to be based on just showing you the sort of, say, if this person was the best performing person that this person learned from, then I'm just going to show them as the parent that appears within that lineage. So even though there were sort of 3 people you could learn from, I'm just going to focus on the algorithm that's followed by the best performing parent that you had in the experiment. And so I'm going to show you again these 2 different algorithms we're interested in, gnome sort and selection sort. So this is what this looks like. So if we look at the first generation here, so this is now generations are going down, and we have a total of 12 generations here, right? So in the first generation, you see a sort of variety of solutions that people are using. And so the different shapes and colors here correspond to different algorithms on that list that I showed you before. But pretty quickly, people come up with selection sort, and then selection sort kind of dominates the population, right? That's the first thing you can take away from this. There's a lot of green on here. The second interesting thing is a bunch of times people come up with gnome sort, but it never takes off. Okay, so there's a better performing algorithm that people innovate multiple times, but it never gets taken up by the population. And if we want to understand why that is, essentially, what it is, it's reflecting this kind of effective inductive bias, right? It's that, it's that hard to understand what that algorithm is, that it's kind of preventing people from effectively acquiring it, and so it doesn't persist in the population. We actually ran 10 replications of these networks, and you can see here all these replications. You can see there's a lot of green. There's one case where there's a small subnetwork that sort of figures out gnome sort and manages to transmit it. But in the rest of these cases, selection sort is the thing that's dominant. And so this is really an effect of inductive biases constraining cultural evolution, right? And this is despite the fact that people are generating demonstrations, they're providing linguistic descriptions. This is just showing the average score. If you just give a linguistic description, if you just give a demonstration, and then what we actually did, which is combining a language and a demonstration. So this is a sort of follow-up experiment we ran, where we looked at how performance varied as a consequence of these different transmission mechanisms. And language does help, right? Demonstrations do help, but the average here is still sort of around this sort of selection sort level. So it's not enough to get you over to the hump that cumulative cultural evolution can take off. Okay, so what can we do? Well, if I go back to our sort of picture of cultural evolution, it's worth remembering that everything we've been talking about so far is just focused on this cultural transmission element. And if we add in some of the other stuff that's important for cultural evolution, such as cultural fitness, it makes a difference, right? So now what we do is it's the same experiment, exactly the same. This is the second condition of that experiment. And rather than you choosing sort of randomly from the people that you could learn from, now you can see the scores of the people that you could learn from. So you can see 8 people, you can see the scores that they got in solving this problem, and you have the opportunity to choose who you want to learn from with the knowledge about how well they solved the problem. And just doing that, just giving people control over who they learn from, is enough that now you get the better performing algorithm taking over in the population. And so, this is a sort of striking effect, right? So this is the proportion of participants who are using this gnome sorting algorithm. And then if we sort of have this random mixing, which was the first condition I told you about, it sort of stays pretty flat. But if you allow people to select who they learn from, then this sort of takes off and then stabilizes with about half the population using this improved algorithm. Okay, so to take this back to the bigger picture, I think the first point here is finite brains and finite lives present humans with challenging computational problems, right? Problems where we need to be able to learn from limited amounts of data. That requires inductive biases and so on. But we also need to be able to communicate with others in a way that makes it possible for us to execute these kind of distributed algorithms. And this gives us a kind of argument for why it is that we need something like language, right? If you think about language being something which is increasing the network bandwidth, increasing the capacity for communicating data, communicating the outcomes of computations between people, then that's something which supports cumulative cultural evolution, supports us engaging in these kinds of distributed computations. But language itself isn't enough, right? It sort of helps. It can sort of help to fight against increasing the bandwidth of that channel, can help to fight against the effect of inductive biases pulling us back. But because language, it poses its own inductive problems, and because it's a noisy sort of channel for transmitting that information, it's not going to be enough on its own to always kind of help us to be able to execute these kinds of complicated processes of cumulative cultural evolution. And so there's another part of this, which is coming up with good distributed algorithms. And so that's the way that I'd characterize selective social learning, right? Being able to choose who you learn from. That's a good algorithm for engaging in this kind of distributed computation. It's an algorithm which we're able to sort of make use of because we have this sort of channels for communication that we're able to employ. And the combination of language together with good algorithms, good mechanisms for effectively engaging in cultural transmission, and building upon that and sort of developing mechanisms for cultural evolution, those are the things that allow us to then engage in this kinds of distributed computations that make it possible for us to do all of the interesting things that we do. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom, for the fantastic talk. So here's how the Q&A is going to work. So I'm going to invite the other panelists who are here with us to ask some questions and have some back and forth. And then I'll open it up to audience questions. If you have a question in the audience, please use the Q&A, not the chat. And if you see a question in the Q&A that you think is interesting, please upvote it and I'll take the questions that people are interested in hearing about. So I'll take the first question from Ev.
Hey, Tom, thanks so much. That was a great talk. I really like this work. I'm trying to think about this. I don't know if this is going to be well-formed enough, but I'm trying to think about this issue of selecting people we'll learn from. And how is it that we end up with these very different kinds of views within our society? Like, for example, like Darwinian, people who believe in Darwinian evolution versus creationism, right? And this is like happening within the same society where a lot of people believing these different things kind of live side by side, interact a lot. And I guess the thing I'm more thinking about is kind of like practically having this knowledge about how cultural transmission works. Is there any way to leverage this in a way so as to maybe make science spread into the sectors of the population who somehow do not choose to learn from people who have these very different beliefs from them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's complicated, right? There are many different factors that go into that are motivational and parts of broader systems of belief, which influence people to believe in one thing or another. There's a graduate student at Princeton, Karim Akhtar, who actually is working on exactly that question of like, how do you get sustained disagreement between people, you know, over time? He's looking at all sorts of factors that are related to that. One of those is like if you make it more or less costly to talk to people who have similar or different beliefs, right? That's something that can result in persistence of disagreement, where if you don't want to have a conversation with somebody who has different beliefs from you, or if it's harder for you to do that because of locality, right? Those are effects that can have exactly those kinds of consequences. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of assumptions that go into this analysis, like uniform mixing, right? And the fact that you don't have different incentives for which things you believe, right? So if we modify the incentives of individuals in the population, those are things that are going to result in quite different kinds of outcomes as well.
Yeah, and maybe a super quick follow-up. It seems like also natural cognitive abilities must factor into this, right? Because sometimes you may want to learn from people who do better, but you just may be limited by your capacities of the kinds of things you can learn and cannot learn. I don't know if you guys are exploring this, but this seems like a kind of potential big source of variability in
Yeah. So in the kinds of experiments that we looked at we haven't measured those sorts of things. And we kind of make a homogeneity assumption, right? That everyone has the same prior distribution and so on. There are analyses. So Andy Perfors, I think, has some analyses that look at populations with, varying capacities, and those again sort of result in much more interesting and complicated kinds of structures. Yeah.
Asifa, do you have any questions you want to raise?
I do have two questions, and I don't know if I should be cheeky and just ask them both.
For it.
So one question I had was whether the inductive biases themselves could undergo change as a function of cultural learning, or whether we have to assume that they're constant. And the other question was just kind of your thinking about what's unique about human cognition in the framework that you've proposed.
Mm-hmm.
So is it the fact that we're able to use language as a tool, or is there something over and above that that distinguishes human cognition from animal cognition, say?
Yeah, those are great questions. So in terms of inductive biases changing, so Bill Thompson and Simon Kirby did some nice analyses of, like, if you have kind of parallel processes of evolutionary forces acting on inductive biases, and then sort of cultural evolution manifesting those in the population. And so they have sort of nice analyses of what happens under those circumstances. In terms of the analyses that I presented, there's a way that you can capture that by, so the simple model where you have learners who get data from the world as well as data from the previous learner. You can use that as a way of making learners who have different biases, right? So it's a way of introducing variation to the biases that they have. So you can say, I'm going to form biases based on some data that I see, and then I'm going to also learn from the culturally transmitted data, right? And so I think that's the closest thing I have to a way of answering that question, which is, there we had this kind of result that it's, you end up getting to something which is like the average over whatever the experience is that you would get, right? So it's kind of like you get convergence to the posterior conditioned on the data that you see privately, rather than convergence to the prior distribution that informs that. In terms of human uniqueness, yeah, it's funny because where I sort of started out was thinking about human uniqueness relative to machine learning algorithms, right? Which is not the way that we normally think about human uniqueness. And what that does is it really emphasizes the biological component of being human, right? In the sense of finite lifetimes, finite amounts of compute. Those are problems that are faced by biological organisms everywhere, right? The sort of the actual magnitude of those constraints can differ, right? So you can have much shorter lifetimes, placing even stronger constraints on learning, and maybe you don't even want to learn very much at all. You can have much more limited, cognitive capacities, meaning that the kinds of algorithms you're going to be able to execute might be even more constrained. So I think, yeah, I think there's an aspect of things that I didn't talk about, which is metacognition. So another thing that you can do to make better use of limited resources is basically be able to plan how you use those resources and make intelligent decisions about how you allocate them. And so when I think about what makes sort of humans unique, it's having both this capacity for distributed computation, which relies on having sort of high bandwidth communications between individuals, which things like language help to fulfill, and then having this capacity for metacognition that means that you can sort of make intelligent decisions about how to deploy cognitive resources within the agent. And those two things are analogous in an interesting way, right? Like the distributed case is how you allocate data and resources across people, and the metacognitive case is how you allocate them inside your own head. But it's those capacities that I see as kind of like being the thing that then leads you to the part of the solution space, which is where you find humans. When you look across different kinds of animals, some of them have some aspect of those different things, right? Like, you have social insects that engage in a kind of distributed computation, maybe with less flexibility, but that you see different ways that different kinds of organisms are trying to engage with those constraints.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks for the great talk as well.
Okay, thanks both. So I think we'll take some questions from the audience and from the room, if anyone here. Oh yeah, I'll take a question from Kenny. Come on up.
I'm sure how far forward I should come.
Very far.
All the way to the front. Hi, Tom. Great to see you. Great talk. I had a question about your science paper. Congratulations on that. So I was wondering if the way people describe the algorithms also improved over generations. So I wonder if one of the problems with gnome sort is that it's weird and hard to describe, and that verbal description that you showed us was pretty terrible. So I imagine computer scientists have developed the ways in which they describe those algorithms to their students, and I'm wondering if once it's stuck around long enough for people to have a shot at explaining it to somebody else, and then those people explain it to somebody else, I wonder if the techniques for describing it refined over generations, if that had a measurable effect in addition to the fitness stuff.
Yeah, so I think that's happening too. Like if we looked at that little subtree that I showed you, where I think this is basically somebody has a good explanation of gnome sort, and then that's able to propagate here. The other thing that I think is interesting in terms of what's going on in these data is like if we look at we have the opportunity to look at things that are transmitted from multiple generations here. Basically, I think that part of what's making the selective social learning work is that, and we actually did an analysis that looked at this, it's that it allows you to get 2 explanations of gnome sort, and from 2 explanations of gnome sort, you can actually kind of figure out what's going on. Whereas from 1 explanation of gnome sort, it's pretty hard to do that. And so if you look at these, what's going on in these structures, it's that basically because you're choosing to learn from 3 people, if you choose the highest, scoring people, it just gives you the opportunity to then select 2 people who had used that gnome sort algorithm, and then you can kind of interpolate and build your own model of it. So I think that's part of what's going on too.
And would you expect that if you took the end descriptions of gnome sort, they're more interpretable by naive participants than if you took the first descriptions? Yeah.
So I don't think we have the data to speak to that, but I think that's what I'd expect. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Take a question from Simon.
Cool stuff, Tom. Thanks so much for the talk. I was trying to square some work, so recent work in language evolution with your kind of framing of the problem. So there's a lot of work at the moment talking about this languages as being on this kind of optimal frontier between simplicity and informativeness.
Yeah.
And the way we've kind of think about that sort of being implemented as or the engine that's creating that, we think of as arising from 2 potentially competing pressures on the transmission of language. So one is the familiar iterated learning under inductive biases, and then we just say there's a bias for simplicity. But the other one, I think, is maybe, I want to know where you think this fits into your framing, which is communication. And so the idea is that when people are actually using the knowledge of language that they've acquired, they're making choices. So there's a kind of selection going on there. They're choosing to produce utterances that will be useful. So I tended to think of that as that what iterated learning is doing is cumulative cultural evolution of transmissible, learnable solutions. And then there's other things coming in working against that to produce solutions that are useful. So is there a place for that second component in the way you're thinking?
Yeah, so the case that we analyzed is this very pure case where it's just about learning, and there's no utility that's associated with hypotheses, right? And the realistic sort of circumstance of cultural transmission is one where, well, for things that other than like maybe like certain kinds of aesthetic objects or something like that, right? It's something where you're transmitting an object and that object has some use, and the use part is a component of what influences which kinds of solutions are found. So I haven't thought about that a lot in the context of language. My expectation, so in a lot of decision theoretic analyses, priors and utilities basically trade off directly. So like if you are going to make a decision between two things, and one outcome is sort of, if it's true, worth twice as much than the other outcome being true, then that's kind of equivalent to, when you're making the decision, the threshold that you would have on the probability of that to choose that thing it's equivalent to like if you had just doubled the prior probability of that thing, right? And so that would be one kind of expectation. So I have to work through the math to figure it out, but you would expect that maybe those transmission processes would favor things that reflect something like the product of the prior and the associated utility. The other case that we've looked at, which is a little closer to that, is the study that Bill ran that I mentioned, looking at cumulative cultural evolution of sort of technological artifacts. And so in that setting, let me show you some slides here. So in that setting, what we were interested in was, okay, you're transmitting these artifacts, but you know not just what the artifact is, which is the inductive part, but also the sort of utility associated with, like, how good an arrowhead is this? And then so we had a sort of simple probabilistic model of this where, like, you're sort of making an inference about the artifact. That's one thing that you're doing, but you're also trying to innovate by considering how the utility is going to change as a consequence of, so you sort of like, you're given some arrowheads, you're like, okay, based on this, my guess as to what a good arrowhead is this, but then I'm going to try out arrowheads, learn something about what makes them good, and then take a step in the direction of the things that make them good. And so this is kind of introducing this explicitly into the dynamics rather than being in the head of the person. And what you can show in that case is that what you converge to is something which is like a linear combination of the mean of the prior and the optimal solution, the thing that optimizes the function that you're trying to optimize. And so that kind of framework might be something that makes sense in the context of some of these linguistic settings too.
Well, thank you very much.
This isn't now published, I should say. It's not. This is old slides.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience now. So first question is from Vera Kempa. I think this is related to some of the things we've already been talking about, but she says, wonderful talk. Can you envision an extension of this idea where the teaching itself becomes subject of cultural transmission? So where agents, participants, humans do not just optimize the cultural trait, but also optimize how to transmit their theories about it, i.e. optimize how to teach. So related to Kenny's question, if you have any other comments.
Yeah, it's related to Kenny's question, and also to these like these models that I was talking about that Bill and Simon had worked on, where you have sort of evolution of these two processes in parallel, right? So now, yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
Okay, another question from Teresa Sanity. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Teresa. So she asks, is there any evidence that in the real world we choose who we learn from and base that decision on the quote unquote parents' previous success rate, consciously or subconsciously?
Yeah, so there's some evidence of this. So the people who've looked at this most extensively are anthropologists like Rob Boyd, who they have done a lot of studies that are ethnographic studies where they look at, for example, like one of Rob's studies is in like people in Fiji building huts. And so they look at, okay, who are the sort of acclaimed hut builders that then people want to guide them in building huts. And they do have some evidence for these kinds of processes of selective social learning. And Joe Henrich actually wrote a commentary on our paper which talks about some of the evidence from anthropology for these kinds of processes in the wild.
Right. Okay, unless anyone from the room for the moment? Okay. Another audience question from Carrie Figdor, who's visiting us now, but is not in the room. Carrie asks, could there be grade 8 inductive biases, primate inductive biases, mammalian inductive biases, et cetera, and how might these be experimentally investigated if so?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, I mean, like I said, the way that we've used iterated learning largely in my lab is as a tool for investigating inductive biases, right? But what you can do in principle is take the same task with different populations and then use that to measure different inductive biases across those populations. So that's one thing that you could do just to get the kind of data that you'd want to get to answer those kinds of questions, right? And then there's a second thing you want to do, which is look at what the commonalities are and see if you can figure out if there are, things that are shared. The big confound in trying to measure inductive biases for humans or, whatever it is, right, is that Bayes doesn't tell you what a human being starts out with. It tells you what a human being sort of knows at the point where you give them a problem to solve, right? It's like that prior distribution is not what you're born with. It captures the entirety of your experience up to that point and the way that it might have influenced the beliefs you have about that task. So I would be very, you have to be very careful when you interpret what you're getting out of this, because it's going to be influenced by whatever experiences people have had. And so for those reasons, what you'd be measuring is not sort of a biological innate bias that's associated with its populations. You'd be measuring something which reflects, their experiences as well. Yeah.
Okay, another question from Sutaro Kita. In real life, we cannot emulate what successful people have done because we don't have the same opportunities and abilities. For example, successful football players inspire many young people to pursue football, but large majority will not make it to the top. I wonder how one can make your cultural transmission model more realistic on this aspect.
So remember, the choice that you're making is who you're going to learn from, and there's not a guarantee that you learn the thing from them, right? So like even in our, let's see if we can find some examples of this. Even in our cases like this, where people have access to, you can learn from someone who knows the good algorithm. Okay, so here's an example. It might be hard to see on your screen, but here's somebody who's chosen to learn from somebody who knows the good algorithm, but then ends up learning this, selection sort algorithm, right? So this is the kid who wants to be a footballer, but doesn't quite make it, right? So that does happen in our data, and it's something that can be accommodated in the kinds of models that I talked about. One interesting thing that suggests, though, is that the calculation that you should be doing as a learner is not just what is the success, the score of the person you're learning from, but also what's the probability that the thing they know is going to be successfully transmitted to me, right? So when you're evaluating your sort of expected utility as a learner of learning from somebody, that's something that you should take into account. And I'm sort of curious. I'm not sure of models that actually explicitly do that. I think that would be an interesting thing to look at.
I'm going to use my moderator prerogative and ask a question. So I was wondering whether, so given the huge potential role for language here in transmitting theories, I was wondering in general, do you have any sense for whether there might be domains out there that would be particularly kind of in trouble here because we're not good at transmitting things via language?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So, I mean, the kinds of things that I had thought about in the context of this and the other work that Bill had done on the arrowheads was just about like, what kind of technological innovations are we not making because they are so strongly counterintuitive, right? So the cases to be worried about are cases where you have something which kind of like, based on our current understanding of the world, we assign a very low prior probability. And as you're saying, where, even if somebody comes up with it, we don't understand them or don't believe them, right? Like those are the things that are going to be the most sort of problematic innovations. And so I can't think of concrete cases that are like that. I think maybe some of the best examples of that historically are things like cases of incommensurability, right? So you have these cases in science where, you know, like going from alchemy to chemistry is an example where you had sort of two just very different ways of looking at the world. And, you know, as a consequence of that, there was not a good way to communicate linguistically about, you know, how to explain the results of a particular experiment or how those theories might be different. So that would be one prediction, is that if you looked sort of historically, those cases of incommensurability would be the cases that are sort of the ones where you'd see the most trouble kind of like getting over a threshold and then sort of getting to the point where people shifted to those kinds of beliefs. But I think it's interesting.
Okay, thank you. Any other room questions? Yes, I'll take one from Annie, a PhD student in the CSE.
I don't know where I am. Hi, Tom. Thanks for a really interesting talk. And my question relates a little bit to the discussion that we just had about like the fact that your calculation might not just be about how successful the person you want to learn from is, but also how good they are at teaching. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you said you hadn't like looked at a lot of algorithms that tested that, but I was wondering, is there a way to maybe implement that in this specific experiment that you have here, but instead where the choice that they make is actually based on like one generation up, so that participants would get a score both based on their proficiency or how quickly they solve the problem, but also on how accurately they transmit that to the next generation. And then people get to choose if they choose a good teacher or someone who's like an expert or like does well. So
the strategy is choose the teachers who have successful students, not the teachers who are successful themselves, right? Yeah, I think that's a great idea. In fact, so one of the things that we needed to do in order to make our experiment work was how we gave people their bonuses. So one secret for running these evolutionary simulations to make them work effectively is you don't just give people a bonus based on their score, but you give them a bonus based on the scores of the people who learn from them. And that way people are pretty highly motivated to do a good job of teaching. But yeah, if you surface that information, I think, that would be interesting as to whether I think you would more quickly identify the good strategies, right? For like the good descriptions that can then lead you to finding the good strategies.
Okay, I'm gonna take another question from Vera Kempa because I think it's related to what we're talking about here. So she says, given that in language learning, children really rarely get to select who to learn from, how would you adapt your model to capture that?
Yeah, so I think that's a case where maybe the original model is more accurate, right? So again, for the language case, I don't normally think about that in terms of cumulative cultural evolution. I know Simon was saying he thinks about it in those terms. So I think when I'm talking about cumulative cultural evolution, I'm focused on these cases where it's about like bringing your beliefs into closer alignment with the world or developing technologies that better solve a problem. Although I think Simon's kind of thinking about this where there's some utility that's associated with having a good way of thinking about the world that comes from language is interesting and motivates a way of thinking about that as cumulative cultural evolution. So, but I think the dynamics that are associated with language are not necessarily ones where you can engage in that kind of selective social learning. Although I'm sure there would be sociolinguists who would say otherwise in terms of, there are various effects of like, kids choosing to learn things from or learning things from peers rather than from parents, or these other sort of more subtle aspects of language where you do see these kinds of, I think, social selection effects at work.
Maybe even earlier, I think there's evidence from infants that they are more sensitive to the phonological categories of native speakers of a language than non-native. So they seem to downweight the evidence from non-native phonology. So that suggests that there is some sort of, possibly because it's noisier. So that could be a place where you do get selective learning.
Okay, a few more questions from the audience, and then we'll stop berating you with questions, Tom. Okay, so this is from Anjum. So usually the scores associated with an algorithm in real life are not evident, right? In real life, the access to optimal information for better performance is restricted in many sense. Comments on that?
So I mean, I think like I said, there are sort of like these anthropological cases that suggest that people are able to figure this out. Like, you know, who is a good baker, you know, who is a good tool maker in your community, and then those are the people that you're interested in learning those skills from. So I think in at least, I don't want to say like in every case that's accessible. In many cases, it might be hard to figure it out. It's not something which is an obvious capacity. You might not know about the secret skills that your colleagues have. But I think for many of the kinds of things that I sort of mentioned as these objects of cultural evolution, you have some material evidence for people having the skills that you might be interested in acquiring.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the great Q&A, and thanks for your talk again, Tom. We look forward to seeing all of you, some of you, but hopefully all of you at the next one, which is Tecumseh Fitch next Thursday. Okay.